In the heart of Baghdad, throughout the 1980s and 1990s, a nightmare walked the streets in human form. His name was Uday Hussein, and he was the eldest son of one of history's most brutal dictators. But what Uday did to the women of Iraq, particularly to the wives and daughters of soldiers who had fallen or been captured in war, transcended even his father's cruelty. This is not a story of warfare or political intrigue. This is a story about systematic predation, about power wielded without conscience, and about suffering that many victims described as worse than death itself. The year is 1979, and Iraq stands at a crossroads. Saddam Hussein has just seized absolute power, consolidating control through a brutal purge of his own government officials. Within this atmosphere of terror and paranoia, his eldest son, Uday, is coming of age. Born in 1964, Uday grew up witnessing his father's ruthless climb to power, learning early that in Iraq, strength meant everything and compassion was weakness. By his teenage years, Uday had already begun to exhibit the violent tendencies that would define his life. Unlike his younger brother Qusay, who was calculating and controlled, Uday was impulsive, sadistic, and increasingly untethered from reality. Baghdad, in the early 1980s, was a city of contrasts. The wealthy elite lived in sprawling villas along the Tigris River, insulated from the poverty that gripped much of the population. Uday moved through this world like a prince, surrounded by bodyguards and sycophants, untouchable and increasingly uncontrollable. His father, despite periodic attempts at discipline, consistently shielded him from consequences. This impunity would prove catastrophic for thousands of Iraqi women and girls. The Iran-Iraq War had begun in 1980, and as young Iraqi men marched off to fight and die in the desert, Uday saw not tragedy, but opportunity. The first documented abductions began around 1982, when Uday was just 18 years old. His method was calculated and terrifying in its simplicity. Using his father's presidential guard and later his own security detail, Uday would identify young women, sometimes simply by seeing them on the street or at a public event. What followed was a pattern that would repeat for 2 decades. A convoy of government vehicles would arrive at the girl's home. Men in uniform would inform the family that their daughter had been selected for a special honor, perhaps to meet important officials or to participate in a government program. The implicit threat was always present. Families who resisted found themselves arrested, disappeared, or worse. These were not random acts of violence. They were systematic, organized, and supported by the full apparatus of the Iraqi state. Uday maintained detailed records, kept by his personal staff, of women he had targeted. These lists included names, ages, addresses, and physical descriptions. Some victims were as young as 13 or 14 years old. The psychological warfare extended beyond the victims themselves. In Iraqi society, a woman's honor was considered the honor of her entire family. By targeting these young women, Uday wasn't just destroying individual lives, he was systematically dismantling the social fabric of Iraqi society, spreading terror through communities and ensuring silence through shame. When Iraq went to war with Iran in 1980, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi soldiers were sent to the front lines. The war would last 8 years, claim over 1 million lives, and leave Iraqi society traumatized and depleted. For the families of soldiers, especially those who were killed, captured, or listed as missing, life became a desperate struggle for survival. The Iraqi government provided minimal support for war widows, leaving many women and their children in poverty. Into this vulnerable population, Uday Hussein saw an opportunity for exploitation that even by his standards was breathtakingly cruel. The wives of defeated soldiers, women who had already lost everything, became his preferred targets. The psychological dimension of Uday's predation cannot be overstated. These women were not simply victims of sexual violence. They were deliberately chosen because of their vulnerability, their grief, and their inability to resist. A widow in 1980s Iraq had virtually no legal protection, limited economic opportunities, and existed in a society that often blamed women for their own victimization. Uday understood this dynamic perfectly and weaponized it. His agents would approach war widows with offers of government assistance, jobs, or support for their children. When the women arrived for what they believed would be bureaucratic appointments, they instead found themselves trapped in Uday's web. According to testimony collected by human rights organizations, after the fall of Saddam's regime, Uday maintained several private villas throughout Baghdad and in the countryside where he took his victims. These properties were fortress-like compounds surrounded by high walls, guarded by his personal security force, and completely soundproofed. Former guards who later defected described rooms specifically designed for imprisonment with reinforced doors, barred windows, and surveillance systems. Some victims were held for days, others for weeks or even months. The women who survived and eventually escaped or were released described a systematic process of psychological and physical torture designed to break their will completely. The trauma inflicted extended far beyond the immediate violence. When victims were finally released, they returned to communities and families that often rejected them. In conservative Iraqi society, the stigma of sexual assault was devastating. Many victims were unable to marry, were ostracized by their families, or lived the rest of their lives in isolation and shame. Some victims took their own lives rather than face this social death. This was not an unintended consequence of Uday's actions. It was, according to survivors and witnesses, part of the design. He wanted not just to victimize these women, but to destroy them completely, to erase them from society and ensure that their suffering would silence any potential testimony against him. By 1984, Uday Hussein had become one of the most feared men in Iraq, and he was barely 20 years old. His power derived not from any official government position, but from being Saddam Hussein's eldest son and designated heir. In Iraqi society, this meant he operated above the law, beyond accountability, and with the full resources of a police state at his disposal. It was in this year that Uday took control of the Iraqi Olympic Committee, an appointment that would give him access to a new pool of victims and provide institutional cover for his crimes. What should have been an honor, leading Iraq's athletic programs, became instead a hunting ground. The Olympic Committee headquarters in Baghdad became synonymous with terror among Iraq's female athletes. Young women who excelled in sports, who trained for years to represent their country, found themselves summoned to meetings with Uday. These were not optional invitations. Refusal meant expulsion from athletic programs, loss of government stipends, and often retaliation against family members. Multiple survivors described arriving at the Olympic Committee building, being separated from any companions or coaches, and then being led to Uday's private offices. What occurred in those rooms followed the same pattern of violence and intimidation that characterized all of Uday's interactions with women. Female athletes were particularly vulnerable because they were already somewhat marginalized in conservative Iraqi society. Women who participated in sports, especially those that required athletic clothing or travel abroad, were sometimes viewed with suspicion by more traditional segments of Iraqi culture. Uday exploited this vulnerability ruthlessly. He knew that these women had few allies, that their families had often sacrificed greatly to support their athletic careers, and that they desperately wanted to continue competing. He used this leverage to demand compliance, threatening not just the athletes themselves, but their entire futures and their families' well-being. The Iraqi national volleyball team, the women's basketball program, and track and field athletes all experienced Uday's predation. In several documented cases, talented young athletes simply disappeared from their teams with no official explanation. Coaches who asked questions were threatened or removed from their positions. The pattern became so well known that some families began refusing to allow their daughters to participate in national sports programs despite the girls' talent and ambition. This effectively ended the athletic dreams of an entire generation of Iraqi women, all because one man could not be controlled. Television presenters and media personalities faced similar targeting. Iraq's state-run television network was required to feature young, attractive women as news presenters and program hosts. These women were carefully selected, trained, and presented as symbols of modern Iraq to the world. Behind the scenes, they lived in constant fear of Uday's attention. Multiple former television employees testified that Uday would watch broadcasts and then contact the station demanding to meet specific presenters. The women had no choice but to comply. Some quit their jobs and fled Iraq. Others endured repeated assaults while maintaining their public personas, smiling on camera while suffering in private. The systematic nature of Uday's crimes within the Olympic Committee became undeniable when, after his death in 2003, investigators discovered detailed records of his activities. These documents included lists of female athletes, their ages, photographs and notations in Uday's handwriting. Some entries included dates and locations, suggesting that Uday was documenting his own crimes. The discovery of these records provided crucial evidence for human rights investigators and helped survivors document their experiences. It also revealed the stunning arrogance of a man who believed he would never face accountability for his actions. The torture of athletes who failed to meet Uday's expectations added another dimension to his control of the Olympic Committee. Male athletes who lost competitions or performed poorly were subjected to brutal physical punishments. They were beaten with metal cables, had their heads shaved, were imprisoned in shipping containers in the desert heat, and in some cases were permanently crippled. These punishments were not secret. They were known throughout Iraq's athletic community and served as a constant reminder of Uday's power. For female athletes, the implicit message was clear: fail to comply with his demands, and the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for them, but for their male teammates and coaches as well. The intersection of athletic administration and sexual predation in Uday's control of the Olympic Committee represents one of the clearest examples of how he used official state institutions to facilitate his crimes. He transformed what should have been a source of national pride into an instrument of terror. Young Iraqis, who should have been celebrated for their athletic achievements, instead became victims or witnesses to systematic abuse. The psychological impact on Iraq's sporting community lasted long after Uday's death, with many former athletes requiring years of therapy to process their experiences. Perhaps most chilling was Uday's use of international sporting events as opportunities for predation. When Iraqi teams traveled abroad for competitions, Uday sometimes accompanied them or sent representatives who identified attractive women from other countries. There are documented cases of foreign athletes and officials being invited to private meetings or events in Iraq, only to find themselves subjected to unwanted advances or, in some cases, unable to leave until they submitted to Uday's demands. These incidents created international scandals, though they were often covered up by both the Iraqi government and by sporting officials from other countries who feared political consequences. Throughout the 1980s, while managing the Olympic Committee and continuing his pattern of abductions, Uday also became increasingly involved in Iraq's media landscape. He founded newspapers and magazines, took control of television production, and used these platforms both for propaganda and for identifying new victims. Young women who sought careers in journalism or media production quickly learned that interactions with Uday were inevitable and dangerous. The Iraqi media became yet another institution corrupted by his presence, with talented professionals fleeing the country or abandoning their careers to avoid him. The mid-1980s marked an escalation in both the frequency and brutality of Uday's crimes. By now, his network of enablers had expanded significantly. He employed dozens of personal bodyguards, drivers, and fixers whose job was explicitly to facilitate his predatory behavior. These men, many of them recruited from Iraq's security services, received substantial financial rewards for their loyalty. They operated with complete impunity, knowing that they were protected by both Uday and, by extension, Saddam Hussein himself. This network functioned as a state within a state, with its own rules, resources, and objectives. The villas that Uday maintained throughout Baghdad became legendary for their opulence and their horror. The most notorious was located in the Mansour district, a wealthy neighborhood in western Baghdad. This compound covered several acres and included multiple buildings, swimming pools, and elaborate gardens. But beneath this facade of luxury were rooms specifically designed for imprisonment and torture. Former guards described soundproof chambers, rooms with reinforced doors and no windows, and medical facilities where doctors, under threat themselves, were forced to treat victims of Uday's violence without reporting the injuries or asking questions about their cause. The psychological manipulation Uday employed was as devastating as the physical violence. Victims described being told that their families would be killed if they resisted, that they would be imprisoned forever if they tried to escape, or that photographs of them would be distributed publicly to destroy their reputations. Some women were forced to watch videos of other victims being tortured as a means of ensuring compliance. This systematic use of psychological torture was calculated to produce maximum trauma and ensure that victims, even if eventually released, would be too damaged psychologically to effectively testify against their abuser. The logistics of Uday's operation were staggering in their scope and organization. At any given time during the peak of his activities in the late 1980s and 1990s, he maintained multiple properties where victims could be held, employed dozens of individuals whose job was to facilitate his crimes, and had access to government resources, including vehicles, weapons, and intelligence networks. He used Iraqi security services to monitor potential victims, to track their movements, and to gather information about their families. This wasn't the work of a single depraved individual. It was a systemic operation that implicated large segments of Iraq's security apparatus. Money flowed freely through this network of abuse. Uday had access to essentially unlimited funds through his control of smuggling operations, government contracts, and direct appropriations from Iraq's treasury. He used this money to reward loyalty, to bribe officials, and to buy silence. Families of victims were sometimes offered payments in exchange for not speaking out. Guards and enablers received luxury cars, homes, and cash bonuses. This financial dimension created a class of individuals whose economic well-being was directly tied to Uday's continued ability to operate without constraint. They had every incentive to protect him and to silence anyone who might threaten their arrangement. The role of female accomplices in Uday's crimes adds another disturbing dimension to the story. Several women, often victims themselves who had been broken psychologically, were forced or coerced into helping Uday identify and lure new targets. These women would approach potential victims in public places, presenting themselves as friendly faces or mentors, and then deliver them into Uday's hands. The use of female accomplices was psychologically sophisticated. It reduced victims' initial suspicion and made the first contact seem less threatening. These women lived in a nightmare of their own, simultaneously victims and perpetrators, trapped in a system that allowed no escape. By 1988, when the Iran-Iraq war finally ended, Iraq was exhausted. More than 1 million people had died, the economy was shattered, and Iraqi society was traumatized. For Uday Hussein, however, the war's end meant new opportunities. The return of millions of soldiers created chaos, displacement, and economic disruption. Families were reunited, but many soldiers came home damaged, addicted, or suffering from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. In this environment of social disruption and vulnerability, Uday expanded his activities, targeting not just war widows, but also the wives and daughters of returned soldiers who were too damaged or traumatized to protect their families. The post-war period also saw Uday expand his business interests, taking control of smuggling operations, import-export businesses, and construction companies. These legitimate business fronts provided additional cover for his criminal activities and gave him even greater access to money and power. He moved through Baghdad's elite social circles with confidence, attending parties at embassies, hosting lavish gatherings at his palaces, and presenting himself as a successful businessman and government official. Behind this veneer of normalcy, the abductions and assaults continued without pause. The international community, focused on Iraq's weapons programs and regional politics, largely ignored credible reports of Uday's crimes. Western intelligence agencies were aware of his activities. Defectors, refugees, and human rights organizations provided detailed testimony about his predation. But in the calculations of Cold War and Gulf War politics, the suffering of Iraqi women was not a priority. This international indifference allowed Uday to operate for 2 decades without facing any meaningful external pressure. It remains one of the most damning aspects of this history, the knowledge that people who could have acted chose instead to look away. The 1990s brought new dimensions to Uday's reign of terror. Following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 and the subsequent Gulf War in 1991, Iraq faced crushing international sanctions that devastated the economy and caused widespread suffering among ordinary Iraqis. The sanctions, intended to pressure Saddam Hussein's government, instead created a humanitarian catastrophe. Millions of Iraqis, especially children, faced malnutrition, lack of medical care, and economic desperation. Into this suffering, Uday Hussein continued his predatory activities, now with an even more vulnerable population to exploit. The economic desperation created by sanctions made Iraqi families more susceptible to Uday's schemes. When his agents approached families with offers of money, food, or access to scarce medical supplies in exchange for their daughters' participation in government programs, some desperate parents felt they had no choice. This coercion through economic manipulation represented a new low, using the suffering caused by international sanctions as a tool for sexual exploitation. It also created a moral complexity that haunted families for years afterward. Parents who had been forced to choose between their children's immediate survival and their long-term well-being. Schools became another hunting ground during this period. Uday's network of informants included teachers, administrators, and education officials who were tasked with identifying attractive students. Girls as young as 13 were summoned from their classes for supposed academic honors or government programs. Many never returned to school. Those who did often faced whispers and accusations from classmates and teachers who assumed they must have done something to attract Uday's attention. This victim blaming was systematic and devastating, transforming survivors into pariahs within their own communities. The targeting of brides on their wedding days represents perhaps the most symbolically cruel aspect of Uday's crimes. Multiple witnesses described incidents where Uday or his guards would arrive at wedding celebrations, sometimes crashing through the doors with weapons drawn, and abduct the bride in front of her family and guests. These were not spontaneous acts. Uday would learn of upcoming weddings through his network of informants, review photographs of the bride, and if she met his preferences, arrange for her abduction. The psychological devastation this inflicted extended beyond the bride herself to her new husband, both families, and everyone who witnessed the event. These wedding abductions served multiple purposes for Uday. They demonstrated his absolute power, showing that even the most sacred moments in Iraqi life were not safe from his intrusion. They humiliated the groom and his family, reinforcing their powerlessness. And they spread terror throughout Iraqi society, ensuring that every family lived in fear that their daughter's wedding might be the next one targeted. Some families began holding secret weddings with no public announcements, hoping to escape Uday's notice. Others left Iraq entirely before their daughters reached marriageable age, joining the growing Iraqi diaspora. The existence of what witnesses called the disappearance list provides chilling evidence of the systematic nature of Uday's crimes. This document, portions of which were recovered after 2003, contained names, ages, dates and locations related to hundreds of women who had been abducted. Some entries included notes about what had happened to the victims afterward. Many were marked simply disappeared or released. Others had dates that suggested they had been held for extended periods. A few entries indicated that victims had died, though the circumstances were not detailed. This list was not kept by law enforcement or human rights monitors. It was kept by Uday himself, a record of his own crimes. The private detention centers that Uday operated represent the infrastructure of systematic abuse. These were not informal holding areas, but purpose-built facilities with female-only cells, guard posts, and administrative systems. Former guards described shift rotations, protocols for handling prisoners, and strict orders never to discuss what occurred at these locations. Some facilities included medical examination rooms where doctors, under threat, would check victims' health to ensure they survived their captivity. The existence of these centers demonstrates that Uday's crimes were not impulsive acts of violence, but rather an organized system of imprisonment and abuse. When US forces discovered these detention centers in 2003, they found evidence of prolonged captivity. Cells contained scratches on walls where victims had marked days, messages written in desperate circumstances, and personal items that had belonged to women who had been held there for months or years. Forensic investigators documented the physical evidence of torture, medical neglect, and psychological abuse. These findings provided crucial validation for survivors who had been telling their stories for years, only to be dismissed or ignored. The physical evidence made it impossible to deny the systematic nature of what had occurred. The impact on Iraqi women extended far beyond Uday's direct victims. An entire generation of Iraqi women grew up living in fear of his attention. Parents refused to allow their daughters to appear in public, to pursue education, or to participate in normal social activities out of fear that they might be noticed. Talented young women abandoned their ambitions, hiding their abilities and their beauty to avoid becoming targets. The psychological cost of this ambient terror is impossible to fully calculate, but it affected millions of women who modified their behavior, limited their dreams, and lived in constant anxiety because one man was allowed to operate without restraint. Uday's reputation for violence extended beyond his sexual crimes. He was notorious for killing Kamel Hana Gegeo, one of Saddam Hussein's most trusted servants, at a party in 1988. The murder was public, brutal, and apparently motivated by Uday's belief that Gegeo had introduced Saddam to a woman who had become his second wife, a marriage that Uday opposed. Even by the standards of Saddam's Iraq, the killing was shocking. For a brief period, it seemed that Uday might finally face consequences. Saddam reportedly beat his son and briefly imprisoned him. But within months, Uday was released, and his activities resumed with little interruption. The torture of athletes who failed to meet expectations or who lost competitions became increasingly sadistic throughout the 1990s. Football players who missed penalty kicks were beaten until they could not walk. Boxers who lost matches had their hands crushed. Olympic competitors who failed to medal were imprisoned and tortured. The specific form of torture, forcing athletes to kick concrete balls until their feet bled, having them run barefoot over broken glass, suspending them from their arms for hours, seemed designed not just to punish, but to destroy the physical tools of their athletic ability. This wasn't about improving performance. It was about exercising absolute control and inflicting maximum suffering. The psychological profile that emerges from examining Uday's crimes is that of someone who derived pleasure not just from the exercise of power, but specifically from the destruction of hope and dignity. He preferred victims who had something to lose, women with families who loved them, athletes with promising careers, brides on what should have been the happiest day of their lives. The targeting was deliberate, aimed at people who represented something good or hopeful in Iraqi society, and then destroying them completely. This pattern suggests a pathology that went beyond sexual gratification to something darker, a compulsion to spread suffering as widely as possible. Medical professionals who were forced to treat Uday's victims faced impossible ethical dilemmas. As doctors, they had taken oaths to heal and to do no harm. But in Saddam's Iraq, refusing Uday's orders meant death or disappearance. So they treated injuries they knew were the result of torture, provided medication to keep victims alive for further abuse, and falsified medical records to hide evidence of crimes. Some of these doctors later described the devastating psychological toll of this forced complicity. They had been transformed into enablers of abuse, and that burden stayed with them long after Uday's death. The assassination attempt on Uday in December 1996 briefly offered hope that his reign of terror might end. 8 gunmen attacked his convoy in the Mansour district of Baghdad, firing hundreds of rounds into his vehicle. Uday was gravely wounded, shot multiple times, and was left partially paralyzed from the waist down. He required multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation. For a period, it seemed that even if he survived, his ability to personally perpetrate violence might be limited. But this hope proved false. While Uday's physical capabilities were reduced, his network of enablers remained intact, and he simply adapted his methods. Post-assassination attempt, Uday became increasingly reliant on his security team to carry out his orders. Rather than personally conducting abductions, he would identify targets and have his guards bring victims to him. His properties were modified to accommodate his wheelchair, and his activities continued with little interruption. If anything, the assassination attempt made him more paranoid and more vicious. He became obsessed with identifying who had ordered the attack and exacted brutal revenge on anyone suspected of involvement. Entire families were arrested, tortured, and executed on the basis of mere suspicion. The years between 1997 and 2003 saw Uday's activities continue, even as his physical condition deteriorated. He became addicted to pain medications and alcohol, mixing substances that made him even more unpredictable and violent. Associates described him as increasingly erratic, subject to mood swings that could turn from jovial to murderous in moments. Yet his essential pattern of predation remained constant. He continued to target young women, continued to use his network of guards and informants, and continued to operate with complete impunity. The assassination attempt had failed to stop him, and no one else in Iraq had the power or the will to try. International awareness of Uday's crimes grew throughout the late 1990s, particularly after the testimonies of defectors and refugees reached human rights organizations. Detailed reports were compiled documenting patterns of abuse, listing known victims, and describing the infrastructure that enabled his crimes. These reports were circulated to governments, international organizations, and media outlets, yet concrete action remained elusive. Uday was occasionally mentioned in broader discussions of human rights abuses in Iraq, but he was rarely the focus of international attention, which remained fixed on weapons inspections, sanctions policy, and regional security concerns. The families of victims faced an impossible situation. If they spoke out about what had happened to their daughters, they risked retaliation. If they remained silent, they carried the burden of that knowledge and the inability to seek justice. Many families chose silence, prioritizing the safety of their surviving children over the memory of those they had lost. This enforced silence created a kind of collective amnesia in Iraqi society, where everyone knew generally what Uday was doing, but specific cases remained unspoken. This silence was exactly what Uday's system was designed to produce, ensuring that his crimes could continue indefinitely without generating organized resistance. Some families attempted to fight back through the only means available to them, fleeing Iraq. The Iraqi diaspora that formed throughout the 1990s included many families who left specifically to protect their daughters from Uday's predation. These families paid smugglers, bribed officials, and took enormous risks to escape, often leaving behind everything they owned. Their stories, told in refugee camps and resettlement countries, helped build the documentary record of Uday's crimes. But even in exile, many families feared that Uday's network might track them down, and they hesitated to speak openly about their experiences. The role of Saddam Hussein in enabling his son's crimes cannot be overlooked. Despite periodic expressions of displeasure and occasional brief punishments, Saddam consistently shielded Uday from any meaningful accountability. This protection was not merely passive, it was active and systematic. Security services that reported on Uday's activities were told to destroy their records. Officials who attempted to limit Uday's access to resources or to protect potential victims were removed from their positions. Saddam's choice to protect his son, despite knowing the nature of his crimes, made him directly complicit in decades of abuse. The complexity of father-son dynamics in the Hussein family adds a psychological dimension to understanding how Uday's crimes continued for so long. Saddam had groomed Uday as his heir, investing him with power and authority from a young age. But as Uday's behavior became increasingly erratic and criminal, Saddam began to doubt his eldest son's fitness to lead. This created a tension where Saddam wanted to discipline Uday, but could not do so too severely without undermining the succession plan. The result was a pattern of empty threats and symbolic punishments that did nothing to curb Uday's behavior. Qusay Hussein, Uday's younger brother, emerged as Saddam's preferred successor by the late 1990s. Where Uday was impulsive and violent, Qusay was calculating and disciplined. He rose through the security services and took on increasing governmental responsibilities, while Uday's official role diminished. But this shift in succession planning did not translate into any constraints on Uday's personal behavior. He retained his wealth, his properties, and his security network. If anything, being removed from the succession may have freed him to indulge his worst impulses without even the minimal restraint that came from being seen as Iraq's future leader. The countdown to regime change began in earnest after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. Although Iraq had no connection to those attacks, the U.S. Bush administration, determined to reshape the Middle East, focused on Iraq as a primary target. Through 2002, diplomatic efforts at the United Nations failed to prevent war, and by March 2003, it was clear that invasion was imminent. For the victims of Uday Hussein, the approaching war represented both hope and terror. Hope that his regime might finally end. Terror about what might happen to them if Uday believed he was about to lose power. In the final months before the invasion, Uday reportedly increased his security measures and moved frequently between different properties. There are reports that he executed several guards and staff members whom he suspected of disloyalty, paranoid that someone might betray his location to advancing coalition forces. Some witnesses described a farewell party at one of his palaces where Uday seemed to acknowledge that his way of life was ending. Yet even in these final days, there are accounts of continued abductions and violence, suggesting that Uday remained consumed by his compulsions until the very end. The U.S. led invasion of Iraq began on March 19, 2003, with massive aerial bombardment of Baghdad. The regime collapsed with stunning speed, and by April 9th, U.S. forces occupied the capital. Saddam, Uday, and Qusay went into hiding, becoming the subject of an intensive manhunt. For several months, their location remained unknown and their eventual fate uncertain. During this period of chaos and transition, some of Uday's former victims came forward publicly for the first time, telling their stories to journalists, human rights investigators, and occupation authorities. These testimonies began to build a comprehensive picture of what had occurred. The search for Uday and Qusay Hussein ended on July 22, 2003, in the northern city of Mosul. Acting on intelligence from an informant, US Special Forces surrounded a villa where the brothers were hiding. What followed was a fierce firefight lasting several hours. Uday and Qusay, along with Qusay's 14-year-old son Mustafa and a bodyguard, refused to surrender. US forces used helicopters, missiles, and overwhelming firepower to assault the building. When the shooting finally stopped, all 4 defenders were dead. Uday Hussein died as he had lived, violently and without remorse. The death of Uday Hussein was met with celebrations in many parts of Iraq. People who had lived in fear for decades felt that a nightmare had finally ended. Some families of victims expressed relief, though many also noted that death had come too easily for someone who had caused so much suffering. There would be no trial, no public accounting of his crimes, no opportunity for victims to confront their abuser in court. This absence of formal justice left many survivors feeling cheated, as though the full story of what had been done to them would never be properly acknowledged or punished. The physical evidence discovered after Uday's death was overwhelming. Coalition forces and Iraqi investigators found multiple properties filled with disturbing materials, including photographs, videos, and documents related to his crimes. They found the detention cells, the torture equipment, and the medical facilities. They found records of financial transactions that revealed the scope of the network that had enabled his behavior. And they found personal effects belonging to victims, items that could be returned to families who had never known what had happened to their daughters, sisters, and wives. The process of identifying victims and documenting crimes began in earnest after the fall of the regime. Human rights organizations, working with Iraqi authorities and international investigators, compiled testimonies, cross-referenced records, and attempted to create a comprehensive accounting of Uday's crimes. This work was complicated by the chaos of post-war Iraq, by the destruction and looting of government facilities, and by the reluctance of some witnesses to come forward in an environment that remained unstable and dangerous. Nevertheless, over time, a picture emerged of crimes that were systematic, prolonged, and devastating in their scope. Survivors who came forward after 2003 described the long-term impact of their experiences. Many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. Some had turned to substance abuse to cope with their trauma. Relationships with family members were often strained or broken. The stigma they faced in Iraqi society remained powerful, even after Uday's death. Some women had emigrated, seeking to build new lives far from Iraq, where their past would not follow them. Others remained, trying to find healing and justice in a country that was itself traumatized and struggling to rebuild. The question of justice for Uday's crimes remains unresolved because he died before he could be tried. There was never a formal legal proceeding that held him accountable. Some of his enablers, guards, and associates were arrested and prosecuted, but many others escaped justice, either because they fled Iraq, because they died in the subsequent violence, or because the chaos of post-war Iraq made systematic prosecution impossible. This absence of comprehensive justice has left many survivors feeling that while Uday is dead, the system that enabled him was never fully dismantled or held accountable. The broader implications of Uday's crimes for Iraqi society are still being understood. His actions contributed to a culture of fear and silence that normalized violence against women. They demonstrated that in a totalitarian system, even the most heinous crimes can continue for decades if the perpetrator has sufficient power. They showed how institutions, schools, athletic organizations, media outlets can be corrupted and transformed into instruments of abuse. and they illustrated the devastating cost of international indifference. The knowledge that people who could have acted chose not to, allowing suffering to continue year after year. For the international community, Uday's crimes raised difficult questions about the responsibility to protect civilians when their own government is the source of threat. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, detailed information about his activities was available to intelligence agencies and policymakers. Yet this information was rarely acted upon or even publicly acknowledged. The focus remained on geopolitical concerns, weapons proliferation, and regional stability. The systematic abuse of Iraqi women did not register as a priority in international policy debates. This failure represents a moral catastrophe, a choice to treat some human suffering as less important than strategic interests. The documentation of Uday's crimes has contributed to broader discussions about sexual violence as a weapon of terror and control. His pattern of targeting vulnerable populations, using state resources to facilitate abuse, and employing systematic psychological torture has been studied by human rights experts as an example of how sexual violence can be wielded as a tool of political oppression.